In this video, we are going to talk about list views. So list views are one of Android's more powerful and flexible controls that we have access to, but of course, like most things, that power and flexibility comes with some complexity. And so I want to go ahead and I want to introduce you guys to pretty much just the basic gist of working with the list view in this video. So I guess let's go ahead and get started. I want to put together a simple activity that displays a list of customers. So pretty straightforward, and yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to call my application list views, and I'm going to go ahead. I'll leave the default on 4.2 for compatibility. I'll create a blank activity, and then I'll finish the wizard. And now, while Gradle does this thing, I want to point out that I did upgrade to Android 1.2 or Android Studio 1.2, so the tabs and some other things will look a little bit different on my screen than they did in previous videos. However, since all of you guys are in the future, you will have been seeing this the entire time, so it shouldn't come as a surprise. Okay, so we now have our awesome application that pretty much does nothing. Let's go ahead and pop open my preview window here. Don't know why that was not popped open. And let's start off with creating a list view. Seems like it's something we would do if we wanted to make a list of something appear. So let's go ahead and create a list view. And like all views, we must give it a width and a height. And I'm going to make it self-tag or self-closing for aesthetic reasons. And well, to manipulate the list view, to add items, to remove items, and all that fun stuff, we're going to need an ID. We need to be able to reference this list view from within our activity. So we give it an ID, and I'm going to give it an ID of activity main list view. Now, you'll notice immediately that when you give it an ID, it now shows you this little preview thing. And I want to really stress that this preview thing that appears over here in the preview window has nothing to do with what the list view is going to look like or behave once we launch the actual application. In fact, right now the list view has no items in it. Also, that preview is super misleading, and the reason that is because list views are so powerful and flexible in Android that you can have different layouts inside to constitute your views. So this particular item 1, sub-item 1 sort of display that you're looking at right now is not at all what your list view is forced or required to look like. There's so many different ways that you can present information with a list view, and throughout the next few videos we'll be exploring some of them. Okay, so at this point, what I want to do, now that I have the list views instantiated, is actually go ahead and add some items. Like I said, if I launched the application right now, the list view would be empty. There wouldn't be any items inside of it. So what I need to do is I need to add items, and it seems like a reasonable thing to do would be to do that inside of my main activity class. So what I'm going to do here is I am going to go down here on my onCreate method, and after my setContentView, this code has to appear after setContentView, I'm going to get a reference to my list view. So I'm going to say list view. Note the import that appeared at the top of the file. We imported that class. List view equals list view find view by ID r.id list view. Let's see how many times we can say list view in one line of code. All right, so we have a reference to our list view, right? So that's the ID that we created in our layout. We have a reference to it. Everything is awesome. Now let's add an item to it. How do you think you would add an item to it? Well, if you're familiar with things like WPF or WinForms or other GUI toolkits, you might think, well, that should be pretty straightforward. I'll just do listview.addItem. Oh, that method doesn't exist. Maybe there's a get items. Well, no, that doesn't really exist either. So you might start to get a little frustrated because you'll notice that as you scroll through the ridiculous amount of methods that this class has for some reason, you'll notice that there really aren't any methods that have anything to do with items. You might start to get the feeling that a list view really doesn't actually have a concept of the items the list view contains. In fact, the list view doesn't have a concept of how many items it has, what kind of data the items are. The list view doesn't even have a concept of what the list items look like. That is all handled in what's called a list adapter. So the list view is, like I said before, it's super flexible, but by being super flexible, it actually doesn't do a whole lot out of the box. You have to tell it specifically how many items you have. You have to tell it, and you have to tell it where those items are, and you have to tell it how to present those items, how to inflate the views and add it to it. And once you do that, the list view will take care of things like scrolling and so on for you, and selection and other things. So what we need to do is we need to give it an adapter. So the adapter is where the items go. And that's really cool because the base adapter class, the base adapter for all other adapters, is really straightforward and so simple that you can do so many different things with it because it only requires you to expose a handful of methods. There are a bunch of different adapters we could use. We could use the array adapter, the cursor adapter, and we can even create our own. And that's where the flexibility of the list view really starts to happen when you create your own list adapter. We'll definitely be doing that later, but for now I want to show you guys the simplest of adapters. So basically, let's say you have a very common situation where you have a list view and you want to display, well, a list of text, I guess, a multiple choice sort of thing. That seems pretty reasonably straightforward. And for that, what we're going to use is we're going to use the array adapter. So I'm going to say array adapter. Now, the first thing you'll notice about the array adapter is it is a generic type. So we should, I guess not forced to, but should provide a generic type parameter. And in this case, I'm going to say array adapter of string. Then I'm going to call this adapter, totally uninspired name, and I'm going to instantiate it. And now when we instantiate it, we'll notice a variety of overloads. Now, they all take in at least two things. So the array adapter requires at least two things. A context. Not surprising, the array adapter does things like inflate views and so on, so you'd think that it's going to need a context at some point. In this case, the context that we're going to satisfy it with is this, or the activity that is currently running. Now, the second thing all these overloads have in common is they all require a layout resource int resource. Now, if you're not familiar with the layout resource annotation that we see right here, the layout resource followed by the ampersand, at symbol, are what that means is that particular field needs to point to a layout resource. Well, I mean, you probably could have figured that out. So what is a layout resource? Like right here on this set content view, r.layout.activity main, that's what we need to satisfy this particular argument with, this particular parameter with, is a pointer to a layout file. And so now you might be able to start seeing, where the flexibility comes in, because I could pass in a built-in layout, I can pass in a custom layout if I wanted to. We'll do that later. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in a built-in layout. And it comes not from RR, it comes from Android's R. So I'm going to say android.r.layout, and it's going to be simple list item 1. And that's the extent, this is the constructor overload that we're going to be using, the top one. So what is simple list item 1? It's simply a layout that comes from Android's R. So notice how I have to fully qualify the path to that R class. So I have to specify that it's underneath the Android package. I have to do that because RR would otherwise conflict. So the R that comes from our particular project would conflict with that if we didn't fully qualify it. So that's really important. If you're sitting here like wondering why r.layout.simplelistItem doesn't work and you otherwise don't get any errors, that's because you didn't fully qualify it at the Android namespace or package. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we need to tell the list view about our adapter. So we created our awesome array adapter. Let's say list view, and what we need to do is we need to use the set adapter method. So we're going to say list view set adapter adapter. Pretty straightforward. All that does is it tells the list view that we want to use this particular adapter. Now, it's important that you remember to do this because as simple as it sounds, as dumb as it sounds, I've actually forgot quite a few times to set the adapter on my list view. Then I go and I hit run and I go to my activity expecting to see an awesome list and there's nothing. And then I have to go all the way back and remember to set the adapter. So set the adapter. Otherwise the list view knows nothing about the adapter and therefore the list view doesn't know anything about the items that it contains. Kind of a useless list view at that point. So at this point, we now have our adapter, and if we open up IntelliSense on our adapter, we'll notice a whole bunch of pretty familiar-looking methods that kind of really remind us of what a list view would be in other platforms. So we have our add method and our add all method, remove and clear, and so on. So pretty straightforward. Now it becomes pretty important that, or pretty obvious that our adapter is what we manipulate our data with. So I could, for example, say adapter.addAll, and I'm going to use the variable. Ooh, I don't know why that happened. I'm going to use the variable arguments overload, and I'm going to pass in. Remember, I wanted to have a list of customers, so I'll do customer 1, customer 2, and customer 3, just as simple strings. And let's go ahead and hit play and see what happens. So that was about 10 minutes to write 5 lines of code. But it is weird. I really am. This video is incredibly important. If you've never worked with list views like this before, it's incredibly important to get a really good sort of conceptual understanding of how list views work, how to think of their data in terms of adapters. So now what we see our list view. So yay! We have 3 items, customer 1, customer 2, customer 3. They're all in this custom, or not custom, but built-in layout. And you notice I can click on them, and there's a cool little Ripley effect thingy that only works in Lollipop. If you're not in Lollipop, you won't get the cool ripple effect. So yeah, that's pretty exciting. So there's a couple other things that we need to talk about with array adapters. A couple other ways that we can make array adapters a little bit more useful and a little bit more customizable. But for this particular example, what I want is I want to have a button on my toolbar, or my action bar in this case, that will add a new item to my adapter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my menu resource, which is my menu main. I can do that either through my Project Explorer, or I can control click right here on this menu main reference in my onOptions create menu method. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a new item. And the item is going to have an ID of menu main add item. It's going to have a title of add item, and I'm going to give it a show as action to always. So what I want is I just want that menu item to appear. I want to click on it, and I want it to add a new customer to my adapter. So let's jump back into our activity, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to clean up the code just a tad, just to make this example a little bit more clear. I'm going to rearrange my method and remove all that ridiculously redundant comments that really bug me. Okay, so now that I've done that, what I need to do is I need to handle when the user clicks on that menu option. So I need to handle that in the onOptions item selected method, and so to do that, I need to have a reference to my adapter variable inside of my onOptions item selected method. And to do that, I'm going to turn my adapter into a field. So at the top, I'm going to say private array adapter string, and I'm going to say adapter. And then down here, instead of declaring this adapter as a local variable, I'm going to declare it as a field, or initialize it as a field. And so you see it turns purple to indicate that we are now referencing the field. Now I can access my adapter variable from anywhere in my class, which is super awesome. So let's jump down here to my onOptions item selected. I'm going to add a else if to this condition. Say else if the ID is add item. Then let's start off backwards. Let's start off with return true so we don't forget it. Then I'm going to say adapter.add item, or just add, sorry, derp, added customer, or whatever you want to call that. All right, so now let's go ahead and hit play. And I mean, this particular example is not going to look surprising to anybody, because it's all pretty straightforward code at this point. All we do is just say adapter.add, and check that out. Customer gets added. Notice that as the list view grows, we can now scroll it. So that's awesome too. Anyway, pretty straightforward, the not very interesting example. So let's make this a little bit more interesting. Like I said, I want to show you guys how to make the array adapter just a little bit more useful for a more real-world scenario. There's a variety of ways to do that. One of those ways is to use a different overload here. So basically, what's going on here is the array adapter is creating an array list internal to it. So an array list that it owns. So it has its own little collection that you add stuff to, and it owns it, and it doesn't want anyone else to have it. Now that might not be useful to you for a variety of reasons. For example, let's say that you want to have your own reference to your own array list somewhere outside of that array adapter that you manipulate directly for whatever reason. Or let's say that you don't even have an array list. You have another class that inherits from the list interface. So basically, this boils down to, what if you want more control over the collection of items that this array adapter exposes? What would you do then? And we'll notice that there's this really handy little overload near the bottom here. And the overload takes in the context, it takes in the layout resource, but it also takes in a list of string. So that seems promising. So now, instead of the array adapter itself owning its own collection, we can pass in our own collection. So let's do that. That sounds like a fun thing to do. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a field. I'm going to create a private list or array list. It doesn't matter really. Anything that inherits from list or implements list. String, and I'm going to call this customers. Then down here in my onCreate method, before my list view code, that's important. And I'll tell you guys why it's important in a second. But for now, just trust me, it's important that I instantiate my customers array right and fill my customers array right here and not after I do my list view stuff. So I'm going to say customers equals new array list. And then I'm going to say customers.add customer 1. And I'll do something different here to differentiate this from our last list. So I'll say customer 1 and then do a little arrow thingy. It doesn't really matter. Or maybe I can do 4 customers too to show that we're going to be using a different data source. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is, now that I'm adding all my customers array, or adding all my customers to my customers array, I'm going to remove the code down here that does the adapter.addAll. And so now our list view has no items on it. But if I use that overload, that constructor overload I was talking about, notice how we have a nullable list of objects. Or nullable list, in this case the generic parameter got lost because of my compilation error, but anyway, nullable list called objects. And that's where I'm going to pass in customers. So now there's one more thing that I got to do here. One more important thing, and that is all the way here down on options items selected. Instead of saying adapter.add, I'm going to say customers.add because I want to manipulate my data source directly. I want to manipulate my list directly without having to go through the array adapter. So let's go ahead and do that, because this is going to introduce a really important concept of how to work with array adapters and how data binding works with list views. So let's go ahead and hit play. And I'll bring my awesome Genymotion virtual machine over here. And so now we see we have our 4 customers with our little arrow, indicating that our new customers array is being used. And it's all listy. It's just as listy as it was before. However, we have a slight problem. Watch what happens when I select add item. Or more appropriately, watch what doesn't happen when I select add item. I'm sitting here and I'm clicking this button really hard and really fast, and no new customers are being added. Now you might be confused, like, is the code that's adding it to the array list failing for some reason? And the answer to that is no. If I were to debug this program right now, I would find that it has all the items, that array has all the items that I added inside of it right now. But you'll notice that the list view didn't update. Now, because of the flexibility of list views and adapters, in Android, you have to tell the list view when it needs to refresh its adapter. So you need to tell the list view when its data changes, and you do that through the adapter. So right down here, when I say customers.add, added customer, what I'm going to do here is I'm also going to say adapter.notify dataset changed. Now I'll hit play. Notice how I do that after the add. If I did it before the add, it wouldn't work. Or it would just lag behind one. And now check that out. Now I can add items. So you might be wondering, okay, why didn't I have to do this before? Well, you don't have to do it before because the array adapter does that behind the scenes for you. In fact, if I went to adapter.add, or add all, just like before, or sorry, just add, and I add a new customer, a new string, and I control-click on add to go to its source code. Now remember, jumping into the Android source code is a very important thing to do, and it's very important to read the code. And we look, and we notice that, what does it do? Well, the first thing it does is it synchronizes. You can ignore that. And the next thing it does is it adds that object to its internal array, right? But then you'll notice the last thing it does is it invokes notify dataset changed. So the array adapter, if you go through the array adapter, it will invoke the notify dataset changed method if you have that particular feature enabled. You can disable that behavior if you want by setting that flag. But that's why it worked before, but it didn't work now. Anyway, I just really wanted to drive home the point of how the notify how the notify dataset changed relates to the array adapter and when you have to invoke it. So yeah, I think that's about it for this video. We talked about the really straightforward way to work with the list view. So not that exciting. In the next video, we're going to talk about a couple more ways that we can make our list views a little bit more appropriate for real world scenarios. So right now we just saw how we can mess with strings and how we can use custom arrays. In the next video, we'll talk about how we can use custom objects and how we can use more advanced layouts than just the simple list item one. So we'll see you guys in the next video.